Welcome back to another video on the channel. Before I move on to today's video, I just want to thank everybody who tuned in last week or was new subscribing to the channel or interacted on Twitter. I will leave my Twitter account in the description below if you want to follow that. In the future I'll be doing more tournament previews and match reviews and match predictions during tournaments. Probably the next will be the ATP World Tour Finals, where I will be writing live text commentaries again and doing daily videos. Obviously more Grand Slams next year and more major ATP and WTA events which I will be covering on the channel, so if you do want to tune into them and follow along, then do subscribe. I will be doing more videos in the future and also more content like this where I just give me opinions on tennis and on trending tennis topics and updating people on how British tennis players are getting on. There is a lot more content coming on the channel very soon, so do subscribe. But moving on to today's video, obviously the Grand Slam title race got even more interesting and complicated after Rafael Nadal won his 20th Grand Slam title to level with Roger Federer on Sunday after winning his 13th French Open title. And I thought I would just do a video, give my opinion on who I think will finish with the most and how I think Rafa's win has changed the race after winning on Sunday. And it's a fun, interesting topic that I thought I would give my opinion on. So one thing I will say before we get into it is that I don't think whoever wins the Grand Slam title race sort of deciphers who was the GOAT of tennis, the greatest of all time. I think, not to downplay Rafa's achievements at all, he's the most dominant sportsman at a single event, in my opinion, in the history of the sport. To win 13 of the same title, tournament that stretches over 2 weeks, 7 matches, is incredible, and it can never be downplayed in what he's achieved at this tournament. But to just look at the Grand Slam title race and then say, Nadal's the best ever because he's finished the most Grand Slam titles wouldn't be fair. 15 of them or 16 of them have come at one tournament. I think you have to look at the Masters titles, who's won the most of them, who's won the most titles across different surfaces, who's won the head-to-heads, who's spent the most time at world number one, to sort of decipher who's the greatest of all time, in my opinion. I think to look at just the Grand Slam title race is a little bit amateurish, really. And if Rafa's won 15 or 16 French, then he has been dominating at one tournament, which, as I said, is an incredible feat what he's achieved there. But to look across all different surfaces and Masters titles and most time spent as well number one would be a better way of deciding who is the greatest of all time. So moving on to the nuts and bolts of the video, obviously Roger Federer, 39-year-old, won 20 Grand Slams. He did undergo double knee surgery back in February of this year, but is looking to return in 2020 to the Australian Open unless he has any mishaps with the injury recovery. He did have, I believe, knee surgery at the start of 2017 as well and missed the full season, and then came back and won the 2018 Australian Open, so he's shown he can do it at the age of 37. Obviously, since that 2018 Grand Slam win for Roger, which was his last, since then we've had Dominic Thiem becoming a Grand Slam champion, we've had Alexander Zverev reach a Grand Slam final, Stefanos Tsitsipas reached 2 semi-finals, and Daniil Medvedev reached the US Open final in 2019. Along with that, Novak Djokovic and Rafael Nadal just continue to dominate Grand Slam events. They have won 9 of the last 10 Grand Slams, and obviously the Grand Slam they didn't win, Djokovic was disqualified and Nadal didn't turn up at, in which Dominic Thiem won the US Open this year, which shows you just how dominant Nadal and Djokovic have been over the last 2.5-3 years. For me, I think it's difficult to see Roger winning anymore. Possibly Australian Open or US or Wimbledon, but I don't see Roger winning any more than one. We've just got that many young talented players who are coming through, who seem to be improving and reaching semi-finals and finals now all the time. Nadal and Djokovic are 4 or 5 years younger than Roger and in the peaks of the powers at the moment, winning Grand Slams all the time, 3 or 4 a year. And with Nadal guaranteed, you'd think 2 or 3 more French Open titles, then it looks more or less impossible for Roger to finish with the most Grand Slams, which looked incredibly unlikely at one stage. Everyone thought Roger would finish on 22, 23 slams and nobody would ever surpass that, but it looks like Nadal's going to do it at the start of next year at the French. Moving on to Rafael Nadal, 34 years old, won his 13th French Open as I mentioned on Sunday, and that was his 20th Grand Slam title. Rafa did win the US Open last year, but other than that he hasn't won Wimbledon since 2010 or the Australian Open since 2009, and he lost last year's 2019 Australian Open final to Djokovic in straight sets. It was a very convincing win, so not great signs for Rafa winning away from the French. Again, similar to Roger, with team in the next gen coming through on particularly on hard court, it's difficult to see Nadal winning many more away from the French Open at the age of 34, but I certainly wouldn't rule him out winning another US. You have to assume that he wins the French every year he turns up at, so another 2 or 3 French for Rafa if he wants them. But for Rafa, for me, although I do believe he's a player that wants to break all the records, he doesn't strike me as wanting it as much as what Rafa and as Roger and Djokovic have over the years. I think Nadal is a player who could retire when he gets to 15 French Open titles, and that's not based on anything, that's just my own personal opinion. But from interviews I've watched with Rafa in the last year or two, he's a person that strikes me as, he wants to get out of the sport in full health, and sooner rather than later. He's talked numerous times that he wants to take his yacht around the world. He wants to create a family, and we know he hasn't got any children yet, but he's mentioned a few times that he loves the idea of becoming a dad, but he wants to wait until he's retired from the sport so he can dedicate his time to it and watch his kids grow up. And I think for Rafa, you have to acknowledge the fact that he has had injuries as well in the past, quite major knee operations and knee problems, and he's a player who won't want long-term injuries or injuries that are going to affect his life in the long run. So I do think he's a player who could retire after winning his 15th French Open in 2 or 3 years time. I'm sure he can add 2 or 3 more slams in the next couple of years, and I think he finishes with around 23 Grand Slams. But yeah, I just think for Rafa, he might retire earlier than what Djokovic and Federer will, and he'd be looking to build a family and travel around the world on a yacht, which doesn't sound like a bad life to me. Moving on to Djokovic, 33-year-old, won the Australian Open early this year for his 17th Grand Slam title. Has won 5 of the last 10 Grand Slams, but he missed out on having no Wimbledon this year, which he's won the last twice, and obviously that disqualification at the US could be very costly when you consider Nadal wasn't there, so it was a great opportunity for Djokovic to win that tournament. The advantages for Djokovic is that he's favoured at 3 slams. Even though team in the next gen is slowly cutting the gap, I still think they're a long way off beating Djokovic or Nadal at a Grand Slam final. We saw a team this year had a fantastic chance at the Australian Open 2-1 up, and Djokovic came fighting back to win. They decided quite easily. Nadal beat Medvedev in a decider last year at the US Open, but I just think the mental edge and the ability for Nadal and Djokovic to produce the best tennis at the biggest moments is what gives them the edge, and also for them as that they're both chasing greatness and they're both still very hungry to win the most Grand Slam titles. And although the next gen are all chasing the maiden Grand Slam titles now, I do think that the top 2 are probably as hungry, if not hungrier, to win Grand Slams and strengthen their claims to be the greatest of all time and win the most ever Grand Slams. Djokovic needs a couple of big years. He is 3 behind Nadal now, which seems like quite a big gap. I think Djokovic is a player who needs to win 5 Grand Slams in the next couple of years, but I do think he can do it. He's won 8 Australian Opens now. He's a massive favourite of that tournament every year. He's won the last 2 Wimbledons. He's favourite of the US every year, even though he hasn't got a great record there. I would still say he's favourite. And if Rafa was to somehow not play at the French or eventually get beat, which is an impossible task, then I think Djokovic will become favourite. But I'm never predicting Nadal to get beat at the French Open ever again after what he done on Sunday and how he played. Djokovic has been more or less unbeatable this year. If you can take that form into 2021, then you do have to see him winning 2 or 3 slams. I think Djokovic is a player who has mentioned that he's going to change up his schedule very soon. I think when he passes Federer's all-time world number 1 weeks, which is guaranteed to happen. due to the points lead that he's got and the rankings being suspended. I think he's about 25-30 weeks behind Federer, which is around 6 or 7 months. But as long as Djokovic, I think, wins a couple of tournaments, then he's guaranteed to pass Federer's record. After that, then there's nobody going to pass him. I can't see Federer getting back to world number one, and I can't see Rafa getting to world number one either. And he's a long, long way behind Djokovic on weeks. I think it's a couple of years difference. So once Djokovic passes Federer and has the most weeks at world number one in history, then he can sort of change up his schedule, and being the world number one doesn't make a massive difference to him anymore or the records. He mentioned the other day, as I said, his priorities and schedule will change to chase new targets. In a 33 now, how long will he go for? I think Djokovic is a player who's going to chase the records until he gets there. If he's still challenging a 38 and reaching semi-finals and finals like Federer was, I think he'll keep playing until he gets the most. As long as he's in touching distance of Rafa and not too far behind, then I do think he's a player who will want to achieve the most in the game, and be considered as the best player of all time. I genuinely think if Djokovic can keep up this sort of level of form for the next 3 or 4 years, or even 4 or 5 years, that's what I've got wrote down. 33 now, I think he can keep this level for another 4 or 5 years till he's around 38. Another 20 Grand Slams. You've got to fancy him to win 2 or 3 more French Opens, 2 or 3 more Wimbledons, another 1 or 2 US, possibly the French if Rafa does retire, when I think he might. I think Djokovic finishes on 24, 25 Grand Slams, and I am slightly biased due to being a Djokovic fan, but I think for Djokovic's consistency and for how dominant he's been over the last 2 or 3 years, and the fact Rafa and Djokovic is still beating all the next gen players in the big matches, then I do think they'll continue to dominate over the next 2 or 3 years, and I see Djokovic adding another 5 or 6 Grand Slams, which would put him in a perfect position to win the Grand Slam title race. Obviously his videos, very difficult to call. With injuries, we don't know. The coronavirus, we might not get all the Grand Slams next year as we haven't had this year, but I just thought it was a fun, trending topic, interesting, complicated debate. In my opinion, it's down to Rafael Nadal, Novak Djokovic. Nadal's got a huge advantage now, being 3 ahead and being guaranteed the French Open. I think if Nadal wants to play at least 39-40, he can continue to add 4 or 5 more Frenches, and then it's very difficult for Djokovic to overcome that. But as I said earlier, I do think Nadal's a player who might retire when he gets to 15 French Opens to focus on his life away from the sport, travelling the world and creating a family. For Djokovic, he's got the advantage of he's the most versatile on all the surfaces. He's favourite at 3 of the Grand Slams of the 4, and he will become favourite of the French if Rafa was to eventually get beat or not play through injury or something like that. And yeah, Djokovic is a player chasing greatness. Is the youngest of the 3, and in my opinion, Djokovic finishes with the most in a very close run thing with Rafael Nadal. But do leave your comments below on who you think will finish with the most Grand Slams. It's going to be very interesting 2 or 3 years to see if Nadal and Djokovic can continue to dominate. But yeah, I just thought I'd give my take on what is a very interesting and trending topic. So if you do have any thoughts on the Grand Slam title race, or who you think is the GOAT of tennis, please leave your comments below, and I will see you on the next video.